Good evening, and welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Rachel Kinderdine, Community Manager, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's program, Among the Braves, Hope, Struggle, and Exile in the Battle for Hong Kong and the Future of Global Democracy. We are joined by Shibani Mahtani and Timothy McLaughlin, international journalists and co-authors of Among the Braves, who are with us today from Singapore. Our moderator is Ambassador Derek Mitchell, former U.S. Ambassador to Burma and current non-resident senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. For those of you who would like to submit questions for our speakers, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen where you can type in your questions. I'll be managing your questions during the Q&A segment, which should start in about 35 minutes. We also just launched our year-end giving campaign. For those of you who have already given, thank you so much. And for those who haven't and who are enjoying our programs, please consider making a donation this holiday season. You can visit our website at lawacth.org to give. So thank you all for being here. And Derek, I'll hand the conversation over to you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you to everyone, all the organizers and members of the ALA World Affairs Council and Town Hall. It's really an honor for me to be here. And I want to say greetings to everybody wherever you are. I'm in Washington. Our guests here are in Singapore. I know many of you are in California. I suppose you could be patching in from wherever, but wherever you are, greetings. Nice to have you with us. I am very pleased, and I am very honored to be in conversation today over the next hour with author journalists Shibani Mahtani and Timothy McLaughlin, who have written an important new book about the Braves, Hope, Struggle, and Exile in the Battle for Hong Kong and the Future of Global Democracy. A title with a very ambitious scope I hope that we can discuss during this session. Let me very briefly give you backgrounds of Shibani and Tim, and then I'll make a few comments before we get into the questions. Shibani first is, well, they're both based, as I say, in Singapore. Shibani is an investigative reporter for the Washington Post with a beat that covers the entire Asia-Pacific region, which I guess we call now the Indo-Pacific region, but the Asia-Pacific region, maybe not including India now, Shibani. She joined the Post Foreign Desk in 2018 as the Southeast Asia and Hong Kong Bureau Chief. She's been honored with multiple awards in recent years, including a Human Rights Press Award for her reporting on the 2019 Hong Kong protests. And prior to joining the Post, Shibani was a correspondent for the Wall Street Journal based in Singapore, Myanmar, and Chicago. Tim McLaughlin is contributing writer for The Atlantic based in Singapore as well, reporting primarily on politics, societal change, and tech news in the region. His work has appeared in the Washington Post, Wired Magazine, Foreign Policy, The New Yorker, Prospect Magazine, and numerous other international publications. He's won multiple awards, including as part of that Washington Post team that won the 2020 Human Rights Press Award. And he had worked for the Myanmar Times newspaper in Yangon, where I had met him and met Shibani years ago when I was ambassador. So I have to mention the Myanmar connection. Good to see you both. I understand this is a well-informed audience, but even the best of us have short attention spans. The Hong Kong street demonstrations dominated the headlines back in 2019, 2020. And since then, we've had a lot going on in the world. We've had a heating up of US-China strategic competition. We've had a hot war in Europe. We have Gaza. We have Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict flaring again. The end of the Arab Spring in Tunisia. Democratic hopes violently suppressed throughout the Sahel and Africa, as well as in Nicaragua and Myanmar, Burma, and a few issues here at home with our own democracy. But I do think it is critical through all this that we do not forget the continuing story and sacrifice of the thousands, if not millions of people in Hong Kong. For one thing, this is not just a matter of history. Developments related to those events that we'll be discussing that are in the book continue to make headlines. Some of you may have been reading about it. For instance, Agnes Cho, you may have been reading about in the past couple of days, who was a leading activist. She just turned up in Canada at university to say she's not returning to Hong Kong, much to the consternation of the Hong Kong authorities. I was just talking to Shibani before. There have been televised forced confessions of activists recently as well, adding a kind of chilling coda to events that are outlined in Shibani and Tim's book. But it is also important not to forget, because we know that autocrats count on our forgetting. The Hong Kong government is trying to suppress the truth as we speak, like those in the mainland who promote so-called patriotic education. We all know the Orwell quote, "Whoever controls the past controls the future." But there is an equally great line, I should say, at the conclusion of Shibani and Tim's book, where they say, "When even the truth is outlawed, the act of recording itself is resistance." And I think Shibani and Tim have done an amazing job, a heroic job of that act of recording. And I really, really commend this book to all of you. Hong Kong is just around the corner. Hanukkah is just around the corner. I think Thursday or Friday, we have Christmas, we have Kwanzaa, we have all kinds of things coming up. So I really commend the book to you all. Anyway, let's begin. I will ask questions for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll take questions from you all after that. Now, I like to say, Shibani, Tim, that facts without context is not truth. The context is everything. So let me start with sort of elucidating some of this basic context to get an overview of modern Hong Kong history. China talks about its century of humiliation. It puts Hong Kong and Taiwan at the center of that narrative. Can you briefly explain what Hong Kong means to China, and maybe a quick summary of the story of Hong Kong from the time of the 19th century to, say, 1997?
Absolutely. Well, thank you firstly to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall for having us, and thank you to Ambassador Mitchell for hosting us this morning, and thank you to all of you for joining us. In summary, right, Hong Kong was a British colony that was essentially won in a war, the Opium War, by the British, and that started, as Ambassador Mitchell mentioned, right, the century of humiliation, where China felt itself sort of belittled and bullied by bigger Western powers. When the British sort of sat down to negotiate over the future of Hong Kong, they had multiple options on the table, but for Deng Xiaoping, for Beijing, only one would fly, right? And that was an unconditional, handover where Chinese sovereignty was reestablished in Hong Kong. And so that handover was negotiated in the 1980s. Hong Kong people did not have a direct say or any real say in what would be their future, and that future was sort of carved out for them by the British and by China. And that was meant to be governed under the one country, two systems framework, which really was designed not just for Hong Kong in mind, but Taiwan, right? The idea was that peaceful reunification with Taiwan could eventually happen too under this one country, two systems formulation, where sovereignty would be handed back over to China, to Beijing, but with, Hong Kong and potentially later Taiwan holding their own sort of systems, currency, so on and so forth. So Hong Kong was meant to be the first in this experiment. 1997, the handover happened. A lot of people were kind of bracing for immediate change. They were bracing for suppression to happen, already, but actually things sort of carried on pretty much as usual until you started seeing a few incursions from Beijing to kind of impose certain things, like in 2003, a domestic security law. But then you saw also immediately a pushback from Hong Kong people who had already understood, right, the power of being able to mobilize, get on the streets, and sort of use that as a way to kind of resist, right? In 2012, you saw the same thing happen with the imposition of the attempt to impose a national education framework around Hong Kong. Again, there was pushback until we got to 2014, which was the umbrella revolution that I think was like the first time that people sort of saw big mass protests on Hong Kong streets happening for a very long and sustained period. That failed in the sense that Hong Kong wasn't able to kind of change what Beijing was imposing or suggesting, which was that Hong Kong's leader be elected only first through a process of screening, and then later on be voted on by the Hong Kong people. I mean, the key, right, was universal suffrage. I mean, people wanted the ability to vote for their own leaders as promised under the basic law. And then that sort of brings us later to kind of 2019, where you have Carrie Lam, the chief executive of Hong Kong, trying to impose this very unpopular bill. You see mass protests, and you see them sort of become about far more than that. And we can sort of go into that in a little bit more detail. But obviously that saw millions of people come to the streets, and then later on a crushing invasion.
Right. So it was kind of in a way, you've gone through a lot of history there. 200 years basically of history from 1842 to basically 2019 or right to the present. But the negotiation over the turnover after the colonization by the British, you have 1984, the Sino-British Joint Declaration, the establishment of the Basic Law that was kind of the Constitution under which the new Hong Kong was going to be ordered. And it's one country, two systems, high degree of autonomy sense. That was the quotes, high degree of autonomy arrangement. There was a lot of nervousness about, what's to become of Hong Kong, this golden goose, this economic, developed financial center. But it was a slow burn. I mean, you had people worried, and then 1989 happened. Just give a sense of how this led up to the 2019 demonstrations. You had people worried in 84, but uncertain. Then you have 1989 Tiananmen demonstrations, where you had people in Hong Kong worried then. To give us a sense of how it went from, say, 89 through 97 to 2003, where this place that was supposedly all about economics started to have some political ferment.
Yeah. Well, thanks everyone for being here. Ambassador Mitchell mentioned that we both knew him from Myanmar. The roles are reversed now. He's the one asking the questions. Usually back then it was us asking the question of him. Hopefully the answers are up to snuff. Yeah, I think 1989, as you mentioned, 5 years since the Sino Joint Declaration was signed, was a massively traumatic and kind of formative moment for Hong Kong, much like it was for the mainland, right? I think the people saw what happened in 1989. Well, even before the crackdown happened, there was a lot of solidarity, right? There were people from Hong Kong going to the mainland in support. And I like to stress here that it wasn't just the kind of pro-democracy activist types, right? There was a lot of support from celebrities, and Noda Moy, who was kind of the Madonna of Asia, movie stars, Jackie Chan, Chow Yun-fat, people like that. There was a huge amount of support for the students that were protesting, not just in Beijing, but across China in '89, right?
Jackie Chan has changed over the years, hasn't he? I mean, Jackie Chan has gone almost 180 degrees.
Just a bit. A number of those people, have shifted positions, right? So, a huge amount of support there. People going to the mainland, donating supplies, donating money. When the crackdown happened, there was a huge amount of distress, sadness, anger in Hong Kong that led to these enormous marches. And I think there was also a feeling that it was now Hong Kong's time to carry on the democratic torch, right? That it had been passed to them through these tragic, incident, and that they would then democratize Hong Kong, the older generation, and from them believed, and then that would kind of spread to the mainland, right? They would be kind of the great force of democracy. And so that's kind of where the older generation came from, right? That they had this role to play, not just in Hong Kong, but development of democracy across China. And I think it's important not to take too long, but when we think about those events, to think about them, in the context of what they were happening then, not in through the China of Xi Jinping of today, right? There was, hope for real change. I think people look at it now and say, oh, they were protesting against the CCP. There's no chance for change. And obviously at the time, there was the Soviet Union was starting to come apart. There was other democracy movements that were happening, in the late 80s, early 90s. So I think there was a huge amount of hope, and obviously that was snuffed out in Tiananmen. In 97, as you said, I think there's a lot of anxiety. The media coverage was very much kind of the death of Hong Kong, the abandonment of Hong Kong by the British, that they were being kind of handed to the wolves. And really for the next, few years, not all that much change, right? And I think people saw that as kind of, a misreading of the situation. There's a term in Hong Kong of astronauts, right? People who left Hong Kong before 1997 or 1997, and they ended up coming back. because the economy kept doing well up until obviously SARS was a downturn, but overall things were going all right, and certainly not the disaster scenario that had been painted out by some people beforehand.
Right. Then you have the 2003 Article 23 national security law kind of issue, but then you had a sense of a foreshadowing in 2014. I mean, 2003, they were successful in kind of sidelining this national security law, that kind of sense of success. But then you felt Xi Jinping's arrival in 2014 when a white paper was released. After him, say something about that, the Occupy Central moment, the umbrella movement, which was kind of foreshadowing 2019.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, one important point, right, to be made with 2003 and even 89, right, is that Hong Kong people really started shaping their identity through these movements and through participation in mass protests on the streets, right? Hong Kong identity was something that was sort of very fluid. I mean, I think people started classifying themselves in different ways through the years, right? British Hong Kong and then Chinese Hong Kong and so on and so forth. But it was in the streets and through a lot of this mass mobilization, right, that people started to understand kind of what it meant to be a Hong Konger, right? And what that meant was sort of using your sort of limited voice, because you didn't have the right to vote and you didn't have the right to elect your leaders at that point. And that was something that was promised to you, but using your kind of presence in these movements to sort of show unhappiness with policies, to show unhappiness with Beijing and so on, right? And it worked, right? As you say, in 2003 with Article 23, they managed to, embarrass the government, shelve that law until pretty much today, and actually, managed to kind of push not only on that sort of killing of potential, repressive laws from Beijing, but also on further kind of democratization and trying to open up that space. And so I think there was a lot of expectation, right, before 2014, when Beijing started, floating different ideas for how Hong Kong should vote their own leader, that, they could actually kind of get something through mobilization. They could get something by showing up on the streets and protesting, right? And it turned out that sort of failed. Xi Jinping was essentially the leader of China by then, and I think was holding pretty firm to this idea that there would not be any compromise on the white paper or on what they were suggesting, right? And that was not acceptable to Hong Kong people, because the Constitution, the Basic Law, which you brought up just now, I mean, it does promise Hong Kong's right to eventually vote its own leader through universal suffrage, right? So the compromise that Beijing was sort of floating, right, that they had to screen candidates first, that you couldn't just actually choose on your own, was really not acceptable to Hong Kong people at all. But I think you saw really a hardening between the two sides then, right? You saw a sort of angering of Beijing, right, by occupying the streets for 79 days, and then you saw Hong Kong people getting more and more stuck in and more and more firm in their sense of what we need to fight for, what we would promised, really.
And essentially what you outline is exactly the danger that Xi Jinping worries about. Whether there was a question, would China change Hong Kong or Hong Kong change China? And this notion of popular demonstrations and affirming, individual dignity and demonstrations was terrifying to someone like Xi Jinping, we know now, who is all about control. So that's why Hong Kong sort of matters. That's why it's very urgent to the folks in Beijing that this get under control. So let's get to 2019 then. And the way you've told this story, I want to make sure that the audience understands. You've told a very complicated story. It's a story where essentially, I mean, it was a leaderless movement in 2019 where, patterned after Bruce Lee's idea, Bruce Lee, the martial art movie star, who said it should be flowing like water. It's formless, difficult to pin down, it's hard to suppress. Just be leaderless and go all over the place and do your own thing. So it was very challenging, I imagine, to report on, but it was a fascinating kind of amalgam of interests and people. But there were millions in the streets. What, a quarter or a fifth at one time in one of the demonstrations, a couple million in the street. And you tell the story, though, through the eyes of 4 individuals. you try to whittle it down to make it understandable, I think very, very effectively, by showing it through the eyes and putting the reader in the position to understand and empathize the individual struggles, the doubts, the passions, the sacrifices, as well as the isolation, the alienation, the exile of four individuals. So it's very, very personal. I think that's a wonderful way of telling this. And I think those who get the book will understand it better because you've done it that way. But maybe just as you tell that story, if you can say something about, again, the origins of the 2019 protests and who they were, who are the Braves, which is the title, and then maybe how you chose the four individuals you did.
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, I think the roots of the 2019 go back. Well, they go back further than this. But if we want to look at kind of like a concrete, tangible sort of moment, in February 2018, a young man and his girlfriend traveled from Hong Kong to Taiwan. They got into an argument. The young man ended up murdering his girlfriend, disposing of her body in Taiwan, flying back to Hong Kong, and then started using her debit cards to withdraw money from her bank account. He was arrested for doing that. Her parents obviously by this point had realized that she had gone missing. He was arrested and in that time confessed to killing his girlfriend. This you would think would be a fairly straightforward open and shut case. They found the body, they have a confession, they have all the evidence lined up. The issue here is really geopolitics, right? Because Taiwan and Hong Kong are on very opposite sides of the question of China and sovereignty. In Taiwan, at the point, separate from China, and Hong Kong a special administrative region. There was no way set to send this young man back, to Taiwan to face charges where he had actually committed the crime. And some politicians in Hong Kong the young woman who was killed, their mother got in touch with some politicians in Hong Kong who I think saw this opportunity to sort of, use her and her trauma and her situation to push through a bill that they thought would very much please people in Beijing. And I think it's important to remember that the people in Hong Kong, the lawmakers, sometimes don't know exactly what Beijing wants from them. Some of them don't have much experience with the mainland at all. And so sometimes they kind of go about things, and talking about the pro-Beijing lawmakers now, go about activities hoping, I think, that will please someone, that they'll get some plaudits, that someone on the mainland will see what they're doing and kind of tell them that they're doing a great job. And so they seized on this opportunity to put forward a bill that would allow for extraditions of criminals from Hong Kong to places where they didn't have existing extradition treaties, and this included Taiwan, but also mainland China. And people in Hong Kong saw this as an erosion of the sort of firewall between Hong Kong and the mainland, right? That they would be able, the Hong Kong, authorities would arrest you, and then the mainland would come over and say, we want this guy back in the mainland for trial, where you're facing a totally different judicial system, one that's not independent, one that there's filled with, very opaque, and where Hong Kong has a common law, open court, British style system. So there's a lot of fear initially amongst business executives and people who made a lot of money in Hong Kong. A lot of them did it in manufacturing, in garment manufacturing, plastic manufacturing on the mainland. And, they set up these factories and they did things at a time when bribes and corruption was endemic in the mainland. So a lot of them were afraid that these business deals from the past could come back to haunt them, that they would get arrested, that if they fell afoul of a partner, they would ring them up and they would send the police over them to pull them back into the mainland. So that's when the original kind of fomenting disagreement with this starts. Later on, it's picked up by pro-democracy activists, by a general or much bigger swath of the population who see this as a really incursion on Hong Kong's autonomy. And that is kind of where we got to in 2019 in the summer, when you start to see these huge protests. They had started in April, gained a little bit of traction. May gained a little bit of traction. June, we see like the huge ones. In July, the really massive ones started.
And just super quickly on our four characters, we wanted the four to kind of take us through the history that we've spoken about. So we have Reverend Chu, who was a Christian pastor. He was there at 89. So much of his sort of activism and stuff was sort of grounded, right, in what happened in Tiananmen. But then, as he takes us through the history, it's like three main people, young people, who sort of kind of emerge in 2019, who are sort of like then the bulk of the story from that point on. The three, one of them is a student called Tommy. He becomes sort of radicalized through the 2019 protests. Police brutality, sort of, I guess is the thing, right? That really makes a lot of Hong Kong people, angrier and angrier, and he sort of follows that kind of trajectory. And then we have Bin Lao, who was overseas in the UK at the time and became very influential on sort of the international front, became very influential online in sort of designing this term called Lam Chao, which basically means, Hunger Games, right? If we burn, you burn with us. So sort of taking down Hong Kong because Hong Kong was sort of treating the protesters, treating its people this way. And then lastly, we have Gwyneth Ho, who was a journalist and was at many of the key points at the movement, and then decides, because of sort of the stature she reached, to kind of run for office, and decides to run for politics and switch sides.
Right. You say, I mean, your title is The Future of Global Democracy. You connect what goes on in Hong Kong, what went on in Hong Kong, with the future of global democracy, which, as I said at the start, is quite ambitious. But it was connected to other things in the region. And I don't disagree with it. I would say absolutely what happened in Hong Kong. We're seeing this all over the world in different forms. But we also saw it in the region itself. There was something that was termed the Milk Tea Alliance. You mentioned Hunger Games and the use of the sort of the three fingers. People who saw the movie, that became something the people in Myanmar in the streets did, and people in Hong Kong did. How is that connected in your view? And is it still connected in any way?
Yeah. I mean, I think, what we saw there, it's difficult to put together, I guess, exactly, how matched these movements are, but certainly across, Southeast Asia and including Hong Kong, around this time, we did see a lot of, primarily young people coming out to the streets and voicing a lot of displeasure with, I think, things that are similar across, many countries, right? So in Thailand, there was pro-democracy movements after many years under a junta. Myanmar's protests, obviously, a direct result to the coup that happened there. The protests in Hong Kong, where people's voices were ignored. I think there's just a lot of frustration, a huge, yawning inequity in many of these places, and a feeling that the older generation is kind of suppressing and kind of holding these positions and really keeping down a younger, perhaps more like progressive, democracy-minded generations or multiple generations in some places. And that's not to say that there wasn't, support from older generations or wide swaths of the populations in all these places. But I think you do see young people kind of yearning for a change. And when, we discussed this earlier in the pre-chat, when you look around the region, there's just many places where the people's voices are being suppressed. In Thailand, there's a leader who is not representative of the election. In Myanmar, certainly a government that is not representative of the people's will. In Hong Kong, there's a government now in place and a national security law that is opposed by the vast majority of people. So this is a kind of around the region here that we work in and that we've been in for most of our careers. I think you really do see this. Not, I think you put it, Ambassador Mitchell, the right way. Not a decline of democracy, but a suppression of democracy. I think there's a yearning for it in many places, for change and for new leadership and for new ways of looking at the world that's just being forcibly put down.
Yeah, and in terms of whether it's still continuing, I mean, if there was that sort of upswing, right, happening in 2019, where you saw a lot of protests and a lot of these movements sort of learning from each other, I think unfortunately what we see now is a lot of the authoritarian states learning from each other, right, and learning how to kind of suppress that in sort of the same way with the use of technology and so on. But you still see that solidarity expressed, like on Joshua Wong's birthday, there were a bunch of Thai activists who were tweeting and telling the world not to forget. I mean, I think there is this sort of idea, right, that in Southeast Asia, Asia more broadly, we're told that we're meant to be sort of subservient and sort of compliant, and everything is sort of framed in this sort of Western and Eastern narrative and Asian values. And I think in the past years, right, activists from all these countries have shown like, no, we are wanting to kind of speak up for ourselves, right, and we are wanting to mobilize in this way, and there's still a lot of solidarity there.
If I may say, I completely agree that the line I use, as you say, Tim, is that democracy is not in decline, it's under attack. And it's under attack from within countries and outside countries. But we're seeing that energy that you say, particularly among young people and women around the world, are really the energy of democracy. Whether it's in Sudan and in Africa, or you look at Ukraine is being attacked frontally, Burma, they're fighting, Myanmar, they're fighting for their lives, for the freedom that they tasted for several years. Cambodia, you mentioned Thailand. You go Hong Kong, it's young people, women, people who are giving everything in order to have more dignity and more of a voice. So I think there's a very, very important point that Hong Kong is a microcosm of that desire, of that demand. And it also affects China, as it were. Maybe some in Hong Kong will consider Hong Kong independent, separate from China, but even the Chinese on the mainland, had the blank paper movement last year, showing that there is that attitude. We want to have a voice. It is natural to want a voice. So this milk tea alliance that was coined of the people of, because milk tea is different types of milk tea throughout Southeast Asia, Myanmar, Thailand, Hong Kong, and I think Taiwan jumps in there as well. That is something real, and I think something that's important to know. Let me ask you, I have just a few more minutes, maybe 10 more minutes before we turn to the audience for questions, so tee those up. But one of the things that the Chinese like to say is that there is a black hand behind all this. The heishou in Chinese, black hand. That this isn't really, Hong Kongers who want this, it's because of the West. Tiananmen, I was in Tiananmen actually in '89. In those days, they talked about the black hand. When I went to Hong Kong and saw you, Shibani, I gave a speech at Hong Kong Foreign Correspondents Club where you hosted me. Afterwards, I don't know if you saw, the Dagong Bao had a full page of pictures of me I didn't know they took of me, and a big black hand in the middle of the page. They're not very subtle. But I mean, tell me about what you think about, do the Chinese really believe this? We've always debated this. Do they really believe there are black hands, or do you think it's a convenient narrative they use to say that it's not our fault, it's the other superpower's fault? What is your thinking on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in Hong Kong was fascinating because you're dealing with a fairly, or at the time, a very open kind of media environment, and just there's an openness that doesn't exist on the mainland in many ways. So I think at the beginning of the protest, we saw Beijing and struggled to, I think they were surprised. I think they struggled to put a narrative together on what was happening. And I think at the beginning of the protest, June, July, you saw it. It was about economics, right? They were kept saying everything coming to the mainland was that young people in Hong Kong are upset because life is really expensive. They can't afford apartments, and that is fueling this resentment. That resentment towards the mainland because people there have done better economically, and property prices were something that kept coming up. In August, you saw that shift, right? They named a person from the U.S. Embassy who was working there at the time, or consulate rather, not embassy. They said that she was they pinpointed her as the woman behind this, and then it just took off, right? Then there was the black hand was everywhere. The U.S. was involved. The British were involved. I think it's twofold, right? It gives them a person to pin this on. It also robs the people of Hong Kong of agency, right? It's the belief that they are too stupid, frankly, to do this on their own, that they're being manipulated, that they're the puppets of the West. And I think that when China deals with smaller states and smaller places, this is a common narrative, right? You see it now in the Philippines that what they're doing in the South China Sea, they're doing it at the behest of America. That Taiwan is a quote, pawn on the chessboard to America's game. This I think is a common theme that happens throughout Beijing's sort of foreign policy, or dealing with movements that it doesn't like. I'll let Shimani probably add a little bit more.
And yeah, to the question of whether they believe it, right? I think in Hong Kong, at a certain point, they absolutely started believing it. I mean, you could see that shift. And there are people like obviously Carrie Lam, and in our book we say she admitted that there was really no such thing as the black hand, and she knew people were upset with her and upset with her handling of it, except upset with her policy. But something started to shift, right? I think especially towards the end, and I think it's also because it was the Trump administration. The Trump administration, was particularly sort of bombastic, right? When it came to China, you saw many sort of Republican senators kind of starting to turn up on the streets of Hong Kong. And then you saw also, Hong Kong people wave American flags and so on. And I think at that point, with that imagery, Beijing became convinced, right? They really became convinced that, okay, even if this started because of this law, even if it started because of this resentment, now it's becoming an American plot to sort of, regime change, right? I mean, and they were sort of obsessed with that idea.
Right, right. And it's actually quite ominous. It's because the national security law of 2020, right? I think it's 2020. It's extraterritorial. They
Yes,
say
yeah.
that anyone who supports treason or secession, so it could be people who are not Hong Kongers, it could be any of us who speak on behalf of Hong Kongers or what they were gunning for, we would be subject to Chinese law, to this national security law, from what I understand. Is that right?
Yeah, and we haven't seen it to that extent, but there is an example that I think flew a little bit under the radar for the media outside of Hong Kong. Was that there was a woman from Hong Kong who was studying abroad in Japan, and she posted on social media some thoughts about the Hong Kong government, about the national security law. When she returned from studying abroad to Hong Kong, she was arrested. So there is, that it is, I guess, widening, and there are also bounties out for people that have left Hong Kong who are living abroad, activists, for them, if you return them somehow to Hong Kong and turn them into the police, there's quite a big reward waiting for you.
Right.
So there certainly is, I think, an attempt to scare people abroad and scare people who are living outside of Hong Kong from continuing to speak about these issues and kind of raise concerns or talk about 2019 really.
Yeah, and they do make it's explicit, I think, in the law that you don't have to be a resident or a Hong Konger to be subject to the law, which is, but as you say, I don't think it's been implemented yet. That might be in response to something another country does. They would do it in retaliation. Let's see. I only have time, I guess, for one more question before we turn to the audience. So I'll have to choose which one. But let me ask about Taiwan and the connection to Taiwan. I mentioned at the start that the century of humiliation, the narrative the Chinese have, connect Hong Kong to Taiwan. The one country, two systems you mentioned, Shibani, was meant for Hong Kong. Deng Xiaoping pledged to Hong Kong as a model for how Taiwan comes back into the fold, and now that seems to be soiled. Can you talk about the connection to what happened in 2019, 2020 to elections in Taiwan, and then connecting it to the elections coming up in 2024?
Absolutely. And I mean, I think, that this is something that's probably not that sort of well sort of written about, but like really what happened in Hong Kong in 2019 really tipped the scales of the elections in Taiwan that were in 2020 the next year, right? Tsai Ing-wen used Hong Kong and Hong Kong's example very explicitly to tell people, vote for the DPP, because if you don't, like, that's what's sort of waiting for you. One country, two systems, and the way it's being crushed, that's going to be the future of Taiwan. And you see it today too, right? Tsai Ing-wen said again just a couple of days ago, think about Hong Kong when you vote, right? And I think, this idea that one country, two systems will ever sort of be palatable to the Taiwanese people, at least in the near term, seems totally unlikely, right? We were actually just at a conference where this was sort of being discussed in the context of Taiwan and this idea of sort of peaceful reunification. What could it look like? I mean, I think for Beijing, that is still one country, two systems, right? And to sort of believe that could work in this current era in 2023, where you still see, as you noted in the beginning of this conversation, ongoing repression in Hong Kong, televised confessions, people saying that they have to flee because they were being harassed by national security police. It's just not going to work. So, Hong Kong really brought the sort of Taiwan Strait issue kind of more in a more sort of like critical place, I think, than it ever was. And then, obviously compounded then by what happened in Ukraine and sort of this rise of authoritarianism everywhere, and this sort of kind of breakdown that we're seeing of the global order that you laid out so clearly in the beginning of this conversation, right? I mean, I think we all feel that sort of tension and that unease, in a very big way.
Yeah, I mean, this is dangerous again. It affects us directly. The Chinese fecklessness on one country, two systems, and pushing Hong Kong away, of being violent and suppressing them, is just alienating Taiwan and pushing them further away, which makes a potential conflict across the straits, more likely than not, which draws us in and draws in security of the region. So this is, as I used to say, the canary in the coal mine. Hong Kong was meant to be a model, and unfortunately it's been the negative model for the future of the region, potentially. So again, I think your book is outstanding in laying out both the, bearing witness to what happened, make sure that people don't forget. You tell human stories, make people understand what went on, but also the broader context. Very, very important for people to understand. With that, I'm right at 40 minutes past. I now turn it over to Rachel. Rachel, to you.
Yes, perfect timing. Thank you, Ambassador Mitchell. And thank you again, Shibani and Timothy, for being here today. I want to start with a question, which I think you touched on a bit, but this audience member asked, why should what happens to Hong Kong matter to Americans?
Sure. I mean, I think, what happened in Hong Kong, demonstrates to me, to Shivani, I would guess, because we wrote the book together, about the how fragile, some of these systems are, right? And sort of how people will go along, with anti-democratic developments, right? I mean, I think that there's as much as you see the protesters and the people that were fighting for this after the national security law came in, you see a lot of people. A law professor at HKU wrote a really good piece about this, talking about the judiciary looks like wind-up clocks, where they just kind of toddle along in line, right? A lot of people fall in line. A lot of people, turn on their friends. It's very sad. It's very kind of shocking to watch, I think. I tried to dig into it a little bit in the story I wrote, but I mean, I think you could do, and people have done, books and PhDs on kind of why people go along with these changes, right? Why they don't stand up and kind of say something when these really dramatic kind of anti-democratic forces start to take over. And I think there are, I don't like too many direct parallels, but certainly, the United States, a place where there seems to be some struggle at the moment with democratic norms and kind of and how democracy is looking, shaping up going into the 2024 election. Certainly some questions there, I think, that are applicable from Hong Kong to the US and other places, again, as to like, why do people go along with this? Is it power? Is it is it money? Is it ideology? I think that's a big question for us. I think that was a very interesting and kind of terrifying thing to observe.
Sticking with the kind of US theme, what could the US be doing differently to support those who are still in or who have fled Hong Kong? And what are your thoughts on the US's geopolitical relations in the region?
Yeah, so I mean, this is something we cover pretty extensively in our book. Obviously, our book is very critical of the Hong Kong government and the Chinese government, but I think there is a very big role in terms of accountability and sort of exploration here, also for the US and Washington and really sort of both administrations when it comes to this particular issue, which is immigration. So, there are really two baskets of things, right, that could have been done when the crackdown from Beijing happened. One is punishment, sanctions, and so on. And the other basket was stuff that's helpful, right? So sort of safeguards, lifelines for Hong Kong people. Quite a lot was done in the first category, right? There were sanctions against US officials, Hong Kong officials and Chinese officials from the US. But, there was and still is a lot of clamoring for immigration pathways, safe haven for Hong Kong people within the US. That didn't happen in the Trump administration and also not in the Biden administration. And I think that continues to be, a huge frustration for Hong Kong people living in the US, right? Because obviously they can't go back home. Some of them have bounties on their heads. They know what will happen if they go back. But at the same time, their presence in the US is based on something called, sort of deferred departure, which has to be extended every year. And I think that sort of makes it very hard for employment. It makes it very hard to sort of set up their life that way. Or you go on the asylum route where you can sort of be stuck in the system for many, many years, right? And we know friends in that position who've just continued to be stuck in the asylum system. So I think that's one thing that a lot of people hope the US could do and still hope the US can do. We know people who are like now potentially going to leave the US and go to places like Canada and the UK because the applications have still been stuck, right? And so that remains sort of a major issue on broader U.S. geopolitics in the region. I think we've seen some, I guess, disappointment from Southeast Asian countries that U.S. engagement happens still primarily along the military lens, not so much kind of the economic or sort of other lenses as well. And that makes it really hard in terms of, competing with China, right? Because if you're not sort of offering things other than sort of a very military-led strategy, that is sort of insufficient, right? When China is obviously the biggest economic and trading partner for a lot of these countries. But that's, I guess, a separate thing.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. You mentioned Canada in your last response. This audience member asked, I'm curious to hear about the latest developments relating to Agnes Chow, how she made it to Canada, what she said, how the Hong Kong government has responded, and what about those the authors found most surprising and least surprising?
Yeah, so I mean, Agnes Chow, I think, to many of the people kind of tuning in here is probably well known, along with Nathan Law and Josh Wong. She was kind of one of the faces of sort of from 2012 from the scholarism in anti-national education protests through the umbrella movement, and then was seen quite a bit in 2019. She has a very large following in Japan, and has been involved in some pro-democracy stuff there as well. Yeah, I mean, she was arrested by the National Security Police almost 3 years ago, was never charged. I think that's part of the strangeness of what's happening, is that she was being held essentially not under house arrest, but she was under police kind of supervision outside of prison, but she had never been charged with a crime relating to the national security law. So the police authorities in Hong Kong agreed to give her passport back and allowed her to go study in Canada and part of the conditions of her bail were that she would be coming back to Hong Kong to periodically check in with authorities. Before they did that, though, there's a very kind of strange and worrisome development, is that they, according to Agnes, brought her to the mainland. They had her write a lot of letters apologizing. They had her visit the headquarters of Tencent. They had her kind of do like a kind of a forced tour of the mainland, showing her the greatness of the mainland, the greatness of China, write letters kind of repenting for what she had done, thanking the motherland for all the help. Then they allowed her to go to Canada. I think, not probably surprisingly to many people, when she was due to return in December to check back in with the police, she's decided not to go. And she said that she will stay in Canada permanently now and not return to Hong Kong. I think, given the conditions that she was being treated under, her inability to speak out because she had vanished from public view, this is not at all surprising that she's chosen to take this path. I do think the thing that is really surprising and shocking, and that people are still kind of getting around because she's talking about it more now, is this tour that she did, these kind of like, confessional letters, why she was brought to a mainland tech company's headquarters. This is very sort of, for lack of a better term, kind of mainland behavior that people in Hong Kong, again, this is a new thing that people have not seen before. Same with, when Ambassador Mitchell mentioned earlier, the kind of forced confessions that have been played on TV yesterday, and apparently there's more to come in that series that's produced by the police. So yeah, and for us, I think, surprising thing, writing the book process, maybe not writing it itself, but on the tour, we were around the US and Canada promoting it. Very interesting for us, I think, to hear from a lot of people from the mainland who showed up, who came up to us kind of quietly after our talks to share their stories. Some of them had been to Hong Kong for the protests. Some of them had parents or family members who were involved in the pro-democracy movement on the mainland. Some of them were just mainlanders who were very sympathetic to Hong Kong. And there was a thought, I think, that was all too pervasive during the protest, that nobody in the mainland cared, that everybody in the mainland wanted Hong Kong to be, roll the tanks in and shut it down, right? And China's not a monolith. There are people there who have the same values, and I think it's dangerous and unfortunate that it always gets painted like that. But it was great to meet people who were involved in this stuff on the mainland and who had quietly been supporting Hong Kongers kind of behind the scenes. That was very heartening and very interesting conversations.
So we had a question come in. What do Xi Jinping's actions in Hong Kong say about his broader intentions in Asia? Given Xi's willingness to violate the Sino-British Joint Declaration, why should anyone trust his promises?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that we say and sort of think about a lot, right? I mean, the Sino-British Declaration is an international treaty. It's, you know, held under the auspices of the UN. And if there has been, you know, such a flagrant sort of breach of it, right? I mean, I think that says something about China's sort of approach, right, as a global power, as a superpower today. And I think the thing that has been, you know, so kind of shocking to us, and again, you know, I would state here that we don't know for sure how much of this is being directed by Beijing or sort of Hong Kong officials who are just kind of trying to please the bosses and sort of doing whatever they can. But even so, you know, Xi Jinping is the one who created sort of that environment, right, of just like pleasing the master. But you know, the repression really hasn't stopped, right? We just don't see like a bottom to this at all. Every time, you know, it seems like they might be kind of done or sort of, you know, things have stopped or eased a little bit, or people are getting a little bit more sort of secure in their positions in Hong Kong, something else will happen and cast like another big chilling effect again, right? The news of the bounties that Tim was referring to earlier was very, very shocking, because not only did they put the bounties on these activists who were overseas, they also started rounding up their families, and sort of subjecting them to lengthy interrogations and detention. And you know, some of these activists had even like publicly cut ties with their families to protect them in this way, right? But still, they're kind of going after sort of family, friends, going after like where it hurts the most, right? And that only happened recently. And then, you know, obviously you see now with these televised confessions, upcoming will be the Jimmy Lai trial, which will pull in a lot of sort of allegations of foreign interference and Black Hand and the US directing all of this. And you know, next year, John Lee said that he's going to pass Article 23, which was the sort of the other domestic security law that actually was toppled, right, in 2003, but they're bringing that back. So this like endless quest for security, right? This endless sort of idea that like no matter what, there's going to be radical elements, we need to stamp that out, will mean that there's really no sort of bottom, right, to see when this will end. And I think that's the thing that's really scary and really worrying.
And the bounties, the televised questioning that you just mentioned, how is that impacting any kind of remaining pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong? What are kind of the conditions for that now?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question that we've been asked on a few of these things about, you know, the chance or you know, the revival of these movements. You know, it's very bleak looking right now, to be frank. You know, the civic space has shrunk so much. The space for any sort of, you know, dissent from the government. They talk now of a term they use is soft resistance. You know, where things are not explicitly kind of anti-government or you know, pro-democracy, but sort of anything that can be seen as sort of, yeah, that they don't like, right? So you know, this talk of soft resistance can be, you know, music, art. You know, there's been warnings that soft resistance could be hidden in art projects that are shown in Hong Kong. That music could have subversive messages. You know, that's worrying, because there's no clear red lines here, right? It's very blurry. They're constantly shifting. So yeah, I mean, I think this space in which to kind of hold any demonstrations, to sort of publicly voice any kind of opinion, you know, to write things in newspapers for columnists or things like that, is a tremendously challenging environment right now. One that frankly just comes with enormous risks. You know, the risk of falling afoul of the national security law, or the police using older laws like sedition, colonial laws that were kind of dusted off in the last few years. It's very high. This is very real. It's very real jail terms. You're not going to get bail. Your family is probably going to get pulled into it. So yeah, extremely high, you know, risks for taking part in even small kind of civic demonstrations.
And I know we're getting close to the end of the hour, so to wrap up, I wanted to ask about the 4 characters in your book, or I guess not characters, activists, but where are they now, and kind of how are they doing?
Yeah, so one of the dichotomies we really wanted to sort of highlight, right, was that, you know, after the national security law passed, really for anybody who was a prominent activist or sort of prominent or named in the movement in a big way, had 2 pathways: exile or jail, right? And obviously a lot of them chose the first option. So Reverend Chu, Bin Lao, and Tommy, They all live in exile in different places around the world. And I think that's especially for someone like Reverend Chu, who's in his 80s, right? He spent his whole life, in Hong Kong, loved his home very much. He said, in a quote to us, "We've become one of these sad, lonely people," and it was that was a very heartbreaking sort of thing to hear, right? Because at the end of your life, where you want to feel like you're surrounded by sort of the comforts of everything right? And for him to have been forced into exile is sort of really, really tragic. The one who is still in jail is Gwyneth Ho. She's part of this big national security sweep that involved 47 defendants. It is the sort of closing arguments for the trial just concluded, almost 3 years till the time they were arrested. But still the verdict won't be heard for another many months, right? And so just to think of this like large group of people, most of them denied bail, who've been in jail pretty consistently for almost 3 years, having not been convicted of any crime, I think just shows like quite how far Hong Kong's sort of common law legal system has sort of fallen, right? And Gwyneth, I mean, she's a pretty incredible person. She's pled not guilty to the charges against her, and hopes to use her position, right, to show the absurdity of the legal system, and sort of using her sort of own plight, right, as a way to raise awareness for Hong Kong, and sort of a way to further her activism as well. And so that's really why we wanted to kind of highlight her within the book, and highlight her writings, and put a lot of it in her own words, because as much as sort of avenues are sort of so closed for resistance, things on the street seem quiet, Hong Kong is quote unquote back to normal, it is sort of the experiences of people like Gwyneth, right? I think that really, sort of show the stakes, right, and show the price.
Yeah. And I'll just add on one quick comment there is if people in the audience are interested, Reverend Chu, who's a character in our book, has his own memoirs came out in Chinese language. There's been a lot of media coverage in Chinese language from Taiwan and Hong Kong. So if there are people who are interested who read Chinese, he has a new book out kind of detailing his life. It's been published in Taiwan just about a week or 2 weeks ago. And again, it's gotten some media attention talking about his very long career in Hong Kong.
Thank you both so much again, and for sharing that. Hopefully people will pick up the book as well. We have a link to the book in the chat, so everyone should get a copy of Among the Braves. Definitely a very important work. But I'll turn it back over to you, Ambassador Mitchell, if you have any closing remarks.
Well, first of all, thank you again, Rachel, and thank you both, Shibani and Timothy, for an outstanding book and a great hour. A couple themes that I heard here that are important. One of the themes of the book, as you say, Tim, was the fragility of democracy, which is an important issue to raise. Madeleine Albright used to chair NDI, where I was president until recently. And she used to say that democracy is fragile, but it is resilient as well. But what you also said is you balance the fragility of democracy with the bottomless insecurity of autocrats, which I think is also a very, very important point. They're terrified. They're fearful. I mean, the Chinese spend hundreds of billions of dollars more than on national defense they spend on internal security because they're afraid of their people. And that's not a very confident way to look at the future. So I think as you say, the autocrats are getting together, and there's a kind of autocracy Inc. going on globally where they support one another. Anne Applebaum writes about this in The Atlantic a lot. She's a wonderful writer about it. But I think the other message of your book, and I think the message for everybody here, is that we need to remain resilient. We need to remain and not succumb to the narratives of democracy's decline, or democracy is, and gnash our hands over this. Oh, woe is us. We have a lot of problems at home. We've got to get ourselves in order. But that doesn't mean we should not be standing in solidarity with others around the world and staying true to them, because they can and should be inspiring us for what they are doing, the sacrifices they are making should be inspiring to us to do the same for ourselves and to be out there supporting them and be as resilient and confident in the rightness of what we're about, of the bearing witness and all that you do in your book. So we just can't lose nerve in this. And what we see when there's an ability to show is that even the people of China on the mainland have those same motivations. The Hong Kong people, we said for years, I'm an Asianist for, 35, 40 years. Hong Kong was always, they just care about economics. They're not political. and lo and behold, you take away their rights and suddenly they become political. They even said that about Burmese before the 2020 election. Oh, well,
Yeah.
they don't care so much about democracy anymore. It's really, and then the moment there was a coup, they're fighting to the death to defend that democracy. The Ukrainians, well, they're really more, half of them are more Russian than Ukrainian. Once they're attacked, so remember the resilience and the strength of democracy and remain in solidarity. And again, I think your book is a great service to that theme of staying true to these people that have sacrificed so much, and whether they're at the end of their lives or hopefully beginning their lives, they have done amazing things that we should learn from and take hope from. So I thank you again for as you put it at the start, what was the line about when even the truth is outlawed, the act of recording itself is resistance. You were part of that resistance, and I appreciate it. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks for everyone for tuning in and for the LA World Affairs. It's been great. Thanks so much.